We have a very special guest on the show today. I met this person by chance on Twitter, and she's now my new best friend. She is the deputy executive editor of Newsweek, Batya Unger Sargon. How did I do?
You did amazing.
Awesome. Welcome to the show. How you doing?
Oh man, thank you so much for having me. It is such an honor to be here talking to you. I hope your listeners have had a chance to check out your brilliant op-ed in Newsweek right now that I was so thrilled to publish. Thank you for that, Darvio, and thank you for becoming my new best friend.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity. I told you offline. That meant a lot to me. You know, it's not every day that, somebody that comes from the hood can be in Newsweek. So I really appreciated that. That really meant a lot to me. So I want to thank you on air like I thanked you off air.
Well, it meant a lot to us, and our readers are really responding to it. It's just funny because we met because you tweeted something about my book, which is about many of the themes that you brought up in your op-ed, which is that we just do not hear from people like you, people who come from where you come from, people who grew up poor, people who are working class. There's been this sort of mass deplatforming of the working class from American media. And at the same time, just like you write about in your op-ed, often this deplatforming, which exposes what you called class bigotry, and I think that's really apt, is done in the name of minorities, in the name of diversity, right? In the name of, racial justice. And I really sort of take offense at that for all of the reasons that you laid out in your op-ed. Like there's something inherently dishonest about it. It perpetuates inequality when you don't let people speak for themselves, and so forth. So I feel like we're really simpatico on this front.
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, I'd never met you. I had never heard of you until I saw that article, and I was like, oh my God, I've never read anything that connected that connected to me that much, because it was exactly what I have been complaining about and ranting about for years on social media, on this show. There is this attitude among people in power, and I think you see it across the board in media, you see it across the board in politics, in the levers of American society and American power, where there is this elite attitude. And my issue is, I don't necessarily have a problem with the idea of there being people in the quote elite, because you're always going to have that in any society. I have a problem with elitism, which is different. It's deeper. That's when you make it through the door, you shut the door behind you, and you say, screw everybody that's still trying to get through the door. That's the stuff that I have a deep problem with. So talk a little bit more about your book and about the subjects that you were speaking on that brought us together.
Okay, first of all, that is so brilliant what you just said. Like, the problem is not that there are elites. The problem is elitism. Like, that right there is just so smart. Okay, so I already know what your next op-ed for Newsweek is going to be about. That's so brilliant. So because I'm thinking, like, in my books, I like rail against the elites, but at the same time, of course, you want people to have access to, the upper, like the problem is like not just that the elites are so different and divided from the rest of America, but that the funnel that gets people there is so narrow. So I think that's such a good point. So my book is called Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. And it's about how affluent white liberals are using a moral panic around race and racism in order to essentially justify their abandonment of the working class. And I argue that they've abandoned the working class of all races. And when I
Mm-hmm.
say woke media, I don't mean woke the way the word originated, which was as Black slang for, stay woke, like stay aware
Right.
of systemic racism, right? Obviously, I think it's really important to be aware of the ways in which the state perpetuates racism, like police brutality, for example. Like, I think that's really important. What woke is to me is when white affluent liberals start obsessing over issues of race and insisting on bringing it into every conversation. Because then I ask myself, okay, why are they doing that? Like, we do still have problems around race, of course, but America has never been this non-racist, right? We've never had a situation where Republicans are asking for police reform, right? We've never been here before. We've never before had a consensus around fighting racism, around the importance of dignity and justice for all Americans. So why is it that at this moment in American history, when we're finally united about this issue, the media won't stop talking about how America is a white supremacy? Like, how is it that at this time, when white supremacists are finally, for the first time, totally marginalized, right, from polite society on both sides of the political aisle, why is it that the media is now obsessed with this topic? And it's not just me who's saying they're obsessed. I mean, I'm sure a lot of your listeners have noticed this, but sociologists have tracked how often words like white privilege, white supremacy, racism, even slavery appear in mainstream media outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, even the Wall Street Journal. And around 2012, these words started to just skyrocket, okay? Like, they started to be there all the time. So why did that happen? Like, where did the market for this obsession with race that does not reflect the areas that we do need to be focusing on, but reflects a total obsession and a moral panic that actually doesn't even help anybody and doesn't even move the needle at all? Where did that come from? And I argue that it's really not about race or even political polarization so much as it is about class. It's really about this class divide that we're seeing in America. What happened was, over the last 20 years, journalists and other intellectuals, college professors, people in the entertainment industry, they have become increasingly separated from the rest of America. From working class Americans, from lower middle class Americans, from poor Americans, and they've really become part of the elites. So journalism used to be this like working class trade. It used to be basically like being an electrician. It was something that you picked up as you were working. You made around the same amount of money as an electrician or a plumber. You lived in working class neighborhoods, and you picked it up as you went. You didn't necessarily go to college. You were working class. Today, journalism is part of the American elites. If you're a journalist working in America today, you start off making very little money, but having to live in very expensive cities, which means you have to be rich, you have to come from money, right? And by the end of your career, you're in the top 10%. And so I argue that as journalists have sort of undergone this status revolution, they really stopped writing for or about the working class. And they've started instead to sort of consolidate their power the way that elites always do. And they're using race in order to avoid talking about income inequality, in order to avoid talking about the class divide, in order to avoid talking about the fact that our economy works so well today for people who have an elite education and works so badly for, the backbone of this country, the working class, the people who make everything, the people who move us places, the people who take care of us when we're sick, the people who basically protected us from COVID. So I argue that they're using a moral panic about race, an obsession about race, not to solve the issues of racism that we still have in this country, but actually to avoid talking about the class divide, to avoid talking about the income inequality in this country that they're benefiting from. That's kind of like the basic argument that I make.
Right. And I would say this, and for anybody who's listening, who's liberal, don't worry. I'll get to conservatives a little bit later because I like to hit everybody. But the issue that I believe, when a lot of times, and I think sometimes Black folks and white folks they don't quite get this part, but a lot of times when Black people are complaining about issues of race, about systemic racism and things like that, who we're really complaining about are elite white liberals, because they're typically the ones who control the system, particularly in the places where we live, right? So I think a lot of times the people in the groups that you're talking about go out of their way to genuflect and try to absolve their guilt without actually really doing anything about it. And that's where, to me, in my view, where a lot of these things come from, where a lot of these things perpetuate. I'm somebody who I'm more into an access conversation versus a quote equity conversation, because to me, if you really want to address racism, the problem is lack of access, which goes kind of ties into what you're saying too, which is a class thing in many cases. So if you really want to address inequalities, then you have to remove barriers to access. But in order to do that, that would limit the power of the people in charge. So if you're having an equity conversation, that is, let me give you a little bit more of what I have, but I still have it. I still control it. So you're still dependent upon me to give it to you. So to me, when I look at this situation, I think that's what I see. I see people who are having a conversation thinking that they're having a conversation about racism, but what you're actually doing is seeing how much you can give someone without making it a threat to your power structure.
I could not agree with you more. We're having a conversation about, diversifying the elites instead of a conversation about making access and upward mobility to everybody. And I totally agree with you. And I'll take it even one step further. I don't know if you saw this Yale study from 2018. The study found that there was a big difference between how white liberals and white conservatives talk to Black and Latino people.
Yes.
Yeah. This is like so staggering. So they found that white liberals, when they talk to Black and Latino people, they dumb down their vocabulary, but white conservatives don't. And I remember reading that. And by the way, I was still pretty woke when I read that. And I remember thinking to myself, there is a sickness in a worldview that makes you dumb down your vocabulary when you see people of color. And yet we are the ones calling the conservatives racists, and they're the ones who don't do it. And I remember thinking to myself, like, what has produced this phenomenon where white liberals literally think, they meet a person of color and they think, oh, I better not use 4-syllable words. Like, it's so disgusting. Like, there's just something so sick in that. But also they're doing it like, because they think like they're trying to protect them. Like, and it's exactly like you said, like they want people who they see as oppressed to be living at their beneficence, to be living like getting handouts from them. They don't believe in autonomy. I love that you use that word, because I think that is such an important piece here. The way that liberals think about the working class is they want more welfare. Like, they want to be the ones granting these people gifts, right? Instead of figuring out how to make sure these people have autonomy and have control over their own lives. Like, that's the thing that they can't stand. And I think that you're right. Like, when you look at, where are the worst outcomes for Black children, for example, where their life expectancy is the same as it is in the Congo, we're talking about places that, are run by liberals. And yet we liberals, we on the left, we don't sit around being like, what are we doing wrong? Like, how are we allowing this to happen? Like, how is it that children in Baltimore are not learning how to read? Instead of actually sitting there and being like, we need to figure out what we're doing wrong here, they sit there and they write op-eds for the New York Times about defunding the police. Like, as if that's
which 70% of Black people don't support, by the way.
I think it's actually 81%. Yeah, exactly.
Well, there you go. Right. Like, we don't support that. and again, that's another problem. Like, they come in with this nonsense and present it as if they're doing it for us, and we don't even agree with it. Like, there was I don't know if you saw this article. There was an article that was written in 2018 in Politico, and it was called The Year of the Black Progressive. And essentially the entire concept of the article was that they know that on the issues, Black people don't agree with them most of the time. 65% of African Americans, according to Pew Research, identify as either moderate or conservative. And they know it. So what they were doing in 2018 were they were running Black candidates who appealed exclusively to white liberals.
Oh, man.
And used that to get them through whatever primary they were in.
Oh, man.
And then in the general, try to bully Black people into voting for this progressive candidate in the interest of Black solidarity, regardless of the fact that that candidate supports things that are not in our best interest.
Wow. Wow. I had not seen that article, but that is, I mean, I can think of 5 examples of that off the top of my head, starting with Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who lost the Black vote to Joe Crowley, the incumbent that she was running against, but she won the gentrifiers in Queens, right? So she was wow, I got to check out that article. I have to say, I don't think that article would make it through today, because that would be considered to be, to like I think that, the editors at this point, that's the kind of story that makes people really angry on Twitter, because it has uncomfortable truths for progressives in it. And I can't imagine them being able to write that article today, but I'm going to go check that out. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, it's, and what's funny is, and this being around people in politics, they can't shut up. So they love to, like, even if it's something you probably shouldn't be telling people you're doing, they have to tell people they're doing it because they want credit for it, right? So,
totally.
So the way that this article was written, it was written like, look at what we did. This is a brilliant strategy. I read it as, you don't give a damn about what Black people actually think.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't know if you saw the news yesterday. The Biden administration is working out a way to pay $450,000 per family to families that had family separation at the border. And I just thought, I don't know where you stand on reparations for the descendants of slaves, but I'm 100% in favor of reparations for the descendants of slaves. And the idea that we're going to be paying people who chose to come here on their own, who chose to stay here in detention, who could have gone back to their home country at any moment, we're going to now pay them $450,000 while 30% of the Black community is living in intergenerational poverty. Like, it just makes me so sick. And I don't understand how we got here. Like, how did that become the liberal position that we're going to abandon the Black community? We're going to abandon the most vulnerable in our country to focus on vulnerable people from other countries. And it's just so tied to all of these other pressures, exactly like you said. Like, when you listen to Black voters, they are moderate. They have, even though they're sort of hostage to the Democratic Party, but they're moderate. They have conservative social values, but that gets completely erased because the Democrats don't feel like they have to earn those votes, and so they don't feel like they have to deliver.
Right, absolutely. And since we're on this path in this conversation right now, and I'm telling you also, by the way, I didn't plan any of this. So we're just going to take this conversation wherever it leads.
Perfect.
Well, and this, exactly what you just said, is one of the things that angers me about Republicans. Because if there's no competition for our vote, this is what Black people are in a position where you have one party that ignores you and the other one that exploits you. That's my opinion.
Totally.
So when we're living in this situation, we're living in this environment where our needs are not being addressed. And it's partially, in large part, from a political standpoint, because there's no competition for our vote. And it's hard for people, when people on the right say, well, those Black people, they just keep voting Democrat. Well, you don't show up. There's election after election after election in Black cities where there's not even a Republican on the ticket, particularly on the local level. So how can Black people have an alternative if you don't even show up?
I could not agree with you more. I really, really, really think that it is, all the Republicans have to do really is they have so much going for them that could appeal to this community. I think things like tax the rich I don't think that has a lot of purchase in the Black community. I don't think that that is a message that's going to resonate. You know, all they have to do is show up and listen and hear them out. You know, there's so many areas where there's overlap, and you're totally right. They just don't even try, and it's dispiriting because the more competition there would be for those votes, the more the Democrats would have to deliver. And I'll tell you something else that is like hard for, you know, somebody who considers herself to be on the left to admit. I was happy to see how many minority votes Trump got. I was happy to see that because I want Republicans to get more Black votes. I want them to get more Latino votes because I want the Democrats to have to fight for those votes, and I want them to have to deliver for those votes. So I was happy to actually see that. And actually, I think we're going to be seeing more and more of that. I think that you know, but again, I agree with you as well. The Republicans are idiots. Like, how hard is it already just to show up and be like, actually, we're not racist anymore. Like, we're going to prove that to you because we really actually are not. And no, we care about you, this community. We care about your futures. We care about your children. You know, I'll give you an example, like school choice, right? Like that is an issue that's just tailor-made to appeal to the Black community, right? The tailor-made to appeal to people who the most important thing to them is the education of their children and that their children should lead a better life, you know? Or I'll say something else, law and order, you know? Like all you have to do is find a non-racist way to talk about crime, and you could get so many of the votes of people who are primarily the victims of crime, who are primarily the victims of violent crime, right? So I totally agree with you. Like, it's so unforgivable for the Republicans to be ignoring these communities, especially when they have never had more opportunity than they do now.
It's amazing, but I also think too, and this will go back to kind of the heart of this conversation. I think class has a lot to do with it too, because I do believe that one of the reasons why Trump got an abnormally large number of amount of Black votes, particularly among Black men, was his economic policies, particularly, you know, offering, you know, all those billions of dollars to Black businesses and stuff like that, doing things that Republicans traditionally would never do, right? They would never put those kind of policies on the table. And I think for sometimes when Republicans try to appeal to Black folks and they try to appeal on the generics, it doesn't work. You really have to address our economic needs, but I would argue that that's a class thing too. And I don't think, for me personally, when I look at the Republican Party, I think that they have an elite problem too. They have an elitism problem too. The people that run the party, that run the Republican Party, in many cases, they hate the idea of being a working class party. They despise the idea of that. I don't believe that some of them are all in on that. And really, if you want to appeal to minorities, being a working class party kind of helps you do that in a lot of ways.
Okay, so I feel like we're twins because I never hear anybody talking about Trump's economic policies the way that I do, which is that they were very socialist, like I am. Like, I think I totally agree with you. He put money in the hands of small businesses. He renegotiated NAFTA, which was a nightmare for labor. So the new renegotiated NAFTA is the most pro-labor trade agreement the United States has ever signed. You know, that single-handedly, you know, gave a boost to the auto industry, right? The trade war with China, the tariffs, even the immigration stuff. We can argue that he went too far on that, but his obsession with immigration, that was the kind of thing that Bernie Sanders used to talk about. That was about protecting working class jobs. And that's why it's the Republicans who historically have been the open borders policy. That was supposed to be the Democrats were the ones supposed to say, like, actually, we don't want to import an entirely new working class who's going to be willing to work for less than minimum wage. Actually, that's going to hurt the Black community. And we care about the Black community because they're our base, right? Like, that was supposed to be the Democrats' point of view. And instead, because both parties have now been taken over by the elites, the Democrats are increasingly catering to this like highly educated, college educated, liberal elite. And what do they want? They want cheap wine. They want to go out to restaurants, and they need domestic labor, right? They want cheap domestic labor. So these people, of course, they want open borders, right? I totally agree with you. Oh, sorry. I went back to criticizing the Democrats when we're now moving on to criticizing the Republicans, which is so important.
Well, hey, this
so
is
important.
we shoot at everybody. So just wherever you go, that's where you lead.
But I think you're right that the Republican elites regarded the Trump phenomenon with horror because it was a populist revolt. It was a working class revolt. It was the revolt of the forgotten working class who had been abandoned by the elites of both parties. And Trump, I mean, whatever you think about him, I did not vote for him. I found him to be, very problematic on many fronts, but on the economic front, it is indisputable that that man stood up for the working class in a way that nobody has for a very, very, very long time, and that was an important and a positive thing that happened here. And honestly, now I feel like the Republicans learned the wrong lesson from it. So instead of learning the lesson that there's a hunger for economic populism among conservative working class Americans, they've leaned all into this like trolling the libs stuff that Trump used to do, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they've totally gone back to the crap that makes it impossible for working class people to vote for them.
Yeah, there are a lot of Republicans who, and you're absolutely right, they learned the lesson of we're going to adopt Trump's personality.
Yes.
And get rid and kind of push aside the policies. When for many people, it was the policies that attracted it. There were a lot of people who voted for him who did not like him, who didn't like his personality, who thought he talked too much, who thought he was a reprobate of a human being, but they voted for him because of his policy. So what you see, and I completely agree, you see a lot of Republicans now, they'll adopt his personality, which is the thing that people didn't like, but not adopt the policies, which was the thing that people did like.
I totally agree with you. So they're sort of doing the inverse of what the liberals are doing. So the liberals adopted this like, university cooked up woke moral panic about race, where everything is about diversity and equity and inclusion, and nothing is about economics or actual policies that would help working class Americans and Black Americans. And on the right, you have the same exact thing happen. They've adopted this culture of owning the libs, this like Trumpian personality of like just being basically disgusting all the time, and totally abandoned all of the, the good policies, the good economic policy that he really, it was revolutionary what he did. They've thrown all of that out the window and they're just doing like Twitter owns.
Right. And the one of the reasons why this conversation is just so important to me is like, as I kind of referenced in the article, is just my background. I grew up in that dual environment. So I grew up around a lot of Black people. I lived in the hood at the tail end of the crack epidemic. So I saw all of that. I remember the house next door to mine being shut down as a crack house. I remember cops chasing drug dealers up my street. I remember a shootout next door to my house. It was a bullet that went through my grandmother's bedroom who lived downstairs from us. I remember all those sorts of things, right? Like my grandfather's van got stolen out of the driveway in broad daylight while we were in the house. I remember all those sorts of things. That was the environment that I went home to, but then I would go to school. I went to private school, so I went to private Christian school. So that was a totally different environment. But, a lot of the people that went to those schools were working class or middle class. They had more money than us, but it wasn't like they would ride around in Bentleys. You know what I mean? So, So I see that there are a lot of similarities. And a buddy of mine, a Black dude, told me once, he said, if you're white and poor, that's damn near like being Black. So there's a lot of cultural similarities there, but we don't see it because we're always, and I believe a lot of this is the fault of the elites. We're almost trained to fight each other. It's like what Lyndon Johnson said: if you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than any Negro, you can pick his pocket. And I think that's kind of the environment that we live in. But because when you listen to what some of these groups are saying, whether it's African Americans or working class whites, they're pretty much saying the same thing. We're being ignored by the system.
Totally. And, it's so interesting. We talk a lot about the Black-white income gap. But if you break down the numbers, so the biggest disparity exists in the top 10%. So if you take, let's say, a Black neurosurgeon, right, who makes $300,000 a year, right? Let's say that's in the top, let's say the top 1%, right? The average income for a Black family and the average wealth for a Black family in the top 1%, 300,000. For the average income for a white family is 1.2 million. Okay, because they have family wealth, because they didn't face the disparities, they didn't face redlining, right? They've been able to accumulate more wealth over time, right? If you go down to the top 10%, it gets much, much, much smaller. The gap. If you go down to the top 20%, it gets even smaller. And by the time you get to the bottom 10%, right, the bottom 10% of Americans, the income gap between Black and white Americans disappears, because when you have nothing, you have nothing, right? There's no difference between Black nothing and white nothing. And it's just so funny to me that, like, yes, it is a problem that the top 1%, the top 10%, that there's a wealth disparity there. That is really a problem. We should pay attention to that. But that's where all the attention is on the Black neurosurgeon, right? And nobody is talking about the Black family with nothing, whose problems are very, very similar to the white family with nothing. Now, again, I don't want to downplay the problems at the top. Senator Tim Scott was pulled over 17 times in 1 year, the year he got a new car, in Washington, D.C. That is a national catastrophe, okay? That is that is something we should be talking about all the time. I do not want to underplay that at all. But what we really see is that the only people talking about these issues, they talk about it in such a way that the entire focus is on the elites and is on, fixing the consciousness of everyday Americans, as opposed to looking at the actual problems and trying to come up with actual solutions. So totally ironically, the Democrats so Senator Tim Scott came up with a police reform bill, and the Democratic senators blocked it using the filibuster because they didn't like it. And then 3 months later, they started calling the filibuster a relic of white supremacy, when they had used it to block the police reform bill of the only Black Republican senator. You can't make this stuff up.
Yeah, the same bill that the Root, which is a liberal publication, said would lead to less Black people dying.
Right.
How do you justify something, shutting down something for political purposes because it was an election year that would have led to less Black people dying? It's mind blowing to me. And this is why I think a lot of Black people, and I've heard people say this, we feel like pawns in this game.
Yeah.
No one is really truly addressing our issues, because it's all a game to a lot of these people.
Yeah. No, that's the worst part about it, is seeing people use Black pain, real Black pain that stems from real issues, in order to further their own economic agenda. And I'll just give you another example. Like we talk, you'll hear like about intersectionality, this is like the new buzzword, right? So you often hear this idea that, all oppressions are linked, right? This is how the sort of progressive left speaks about it. The struggle for gay rights and trans rights and Black equality, right? And, rights for Muslims, that these are all somehow connected. And I find this to be, I'm sorry, but I find this to be morally repugnant. Like the idea of connecting Caitlyn Jenner's life or struggle, such that it is, with that of Black children in Baltimore, it just seems to me so repulsive. Like, come on. Like, a trans billionaire is not in any way oppressed in the way that so many of these children are. But that's how so what's in it? Why would they do that? Why would they connect it? Why would they connect the struggle of a Republican trans billionaire to that of actually oppressed children who don't have enough to eat, who are living in, gang warfare, who, like I said earlier, have the life expectancy of a person living in the Congo, right? What does it get them to connect those two things that are not in any way comparable or connected? And I really think it's about, protecting the elites, protecting their status from any kind of real revolutionary action that would actually fundamentally change America and make it a more equal society.
Obviously, like you said earlier, clearly we're not where we used to be. I'm very sensitive about that because my family originates from the South, but my family has a history of living long. So I've been blessed to be able to know, my grandmother and my great grandfather.
Wow.
And like my great grandfather died in the 90s, and he was raised by his grandfather who was born a slave. Right. So,
wow.
and
oh my
his
gosh.
grandfather lived into the 1970s.
Wow.
So my great grandfather's children, 4 of them are still alive today. So you have people on walking the earth today who have vivid memories of their former slave grandfather, great grandfather, right? So
that is amazing.
So that's something that is really like, that means a lot to me because we come, like, that's the stock that I come from. I come from a traditional Southern Black Christian, like my great grandfather was a deacon, my mother's a minister. Like I come from a traditional Southern Black Christian family, like what you would typically see in a Tyler Perry comedy. That's my family, right? So I clearly understand that things are better than they used to be in a lot of different ways. But I would argue economically, they're getting worse.
I totally agree with that. But I think that they're getting worse, like for very specific communities, specifically
Correct.
The descendants of slaves. And when we talk about race in such a general way, where it's racist to want there to be a national border, or, that it only matters the number of people of color on a board, essentially what you're doing is you're diluting the problem. You know what I mean? Like, we have a problem, which is that we never paid reparations for slavery, and the descendants of slaves are still living in intergenerational poverty in many places in America. Like Nigerian immigrants, on the other hand, are one of the highest earning groups in America, right? But for most of liberals, their equity and inclusion efforts they're totally blind to the differences between those two communities, right? They're just counting people of color. And so you're not actually going to help the people who we have totally abandoned, but you're going to make yourself feel a lot better because you're going to look around you and see more diversity. And that's what I really object to. I think that a lot of the language around race among affluent white liberals who are in charge of a lot of what goes on in this country is about making white people feel good as opposed to actually solving the problems and rescuing the communities and building them up and granting them autonomy, the communities that we have abandoned from day one.
Absolutely. It's not about us. It's about them. It's about how it's the white savior complex, right? Like it's about them. It's about how they feel, how it makes them feel. It's not about actually solving the problem. And I argue that one of the reasons why it's not about solving the problem is because a lot of these white liberals are elite, and they live among the elite. They don't know Black people who come from situations like I come from. So their approach, I'll give you a perfect example. I saw this company, I'm not going to say the name of it, but it's like a marketing company or something like that. And they were going all in on Black Lives Matter and Juneteenth and all this stuff, right? I was just curious. I said, I'm going to go to your company's website. I said, let me look at your corporate staff. They're all white.
Right, of course.
All white. So you can tell me that Black Lives Matter, but your organization is showing me that Black lives don't.
Right. It's a real problem, and I think that it's it's only exacerbated by the sort of like the inability to hear from people that we disagree with. And
Yeah.
like you said, a lot of these people don't know Black people. And so they'll read an op-ed in the New York Times the day after Trump was, got 18% of Black men to vote for him. And the op-ed will say, all of those people of color who voted for Trump are handmaidens of white supremacy, How can you talk that way? Like, how can you
Yeah.
how can you say that? Like, how does a person let that idea like cross their mind?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's a lot of Black people feel that, and we see this on both sides, that the white people in power, the white elites in power, only love Black people when we say what you want us to say. A lot of Black people feel like that. I've been in environments and experiences in my media career. I won't say any names, but in my media career early on, where it was like, oh, you want my Black face, but you want to hear your voice when my mouth opens.
Mm.
And a lot of times that happens. So really what's amazing about this is it boomerangs in so many different ways, because you'll have the white working class on the one hand feeling like all the attention and all the catering and everything is going to us as Black people, but it's like they're not really serving us either.
Yeah, totally.
Like, they're not really catering to us either. This is a conversation that they're having amongst themselves. They're not serving the white working class properly. They're not serving Black people properly. But because of the way that it's presented, and because they control the levers of media, they control culture, they control education, they control everything when it comes to the culture of America, this image is presented in that way. And I personally think, and I'd love to know what you think, I personally think that contributes to strife between Black and white working class, because the white working class, who may not know the difference, who may not be as intimately aware of these issues, who may not know that, okay, yeah, that person's Black, but he's surrounded by white liberals and they're the one pushing him. You know what I mean? Like, who may not know that, they look at it and say, oh, well, the system is just catering to Black people. But not the Black people that come from where I come from. We're not part of the conversation either.
I totally agree with you. I think that the class component has been very purposely erased from the conversation. And when you do that, like, and you only talk about race, and that becomes sort of your primary lens through which you analyze American politics and through which you talk about things, like, is it then the fault of the white working class that they're going to start talking about things that way too? So I agree with you completely. Like, the elites very much benefit from pitting poor working class white people against poor working class Black people. And they have done for a very long time. And in fact, you wrote in your op-ed so beautifully about Bacon's Rebellion that united Black slaves with indentured white servants in colonial America, and how important that was, and also how big of a threat that was, and how that was the impetus for the slave race laws that made it a crime for Black slaves and white indentured servants to socialize and intermingle and intermarry and so forth. That color line was created out of the terror that class solidarity was able to inspire in the elites. And I just thought that was so great that you brought that into that op-ed, because that is such an important point.
Oh, I appreciate that. And I don't hear a lot of people talking about it, because it makes, like, if we're having this conversation about, re-examining our history and stuff like that, and going through, the history of America, how can we not go back to where all of this started? Like, prior to Bacon's Rebellion, there was very little to no distinction in American law between Black and white. It was Bacon's Rebellion. It was because Black slaves and white indentured servants uniting together was a threat to the power structure of the system. It was a threat to the elites at that time because they got together, the black slaves and the white indentured servants got together and they took over the state capitol and burned it to the ground.
Amazing.
Martin Luther King talked about this, and he was talking to one of the white jailers.
Mm-hmm.
And he said he was having a conversation with him, and the white jailer was talking to him about his living conditions and, about how little he was getting paid and all this kind of stuff and the things that he had to deal with. Martin Luther King told him, he said, instead of you being in here, you need to be out there marching with us.
I love that. Oh my gosh, man.
There's so much of that. There's so much of that where us being divided, at that level helps the elite.
Totally.
Because it keeps them in power.
So let me ask you this though. So you said your school was Christian. Are you still religious?
Yes, I'm a devout Christian.
And I'm religious as well. And I think that I'm Jewish. And I think that I think what religion gives us is a very useful paradigm for overcoming the divisiveness, because you kind of have this like higher power, and so anybody else who sort of you feel answerable, like to something outside of yourself, outside of your own interests.
Yes,
you're supposed it's not just about you. And I think that a lot of our problems stem from the fact that people no longer think like that. Like a lot of people are not religious anymore, and they've lost the ability to say like what we really as Americans need to say, which is that this concept of America is greater than any individual party or any individual person. And so Absolutely. I'm going to put aside what's in my interest right now for the greater good, for the common good, because this idea is worth defending and worth fighting for and worth protecting. Like people have really lost that. And so I think I could tell that you were religious because you speak like a person who just is answering to not just a higher power, but who has like a larger perspective that transcends just like your individual place in the world, and also the ability to see things from somebody else's point of view and to understand where that intersects with yours, where it doesn't, and then still have respect for that.
I appreciate that. And I mean, it's, faith is a core part of my identity. Like I always tell people, I can't separate my faith from myself any more than I can separate being Black. Like that's how core
That's so
my identity is. And to me, I would argue, and we can have, since we're both religious, we can have this conversation. I would argue that every social movement has to deal with the excesses in that movement. Mm-hmm. And if you don't, the movement becomes very different. It goes from being a movement of justice to a movement of vengeance. And I'm in the justice business. I'm not in the vengeance business. And I would argue that one of the major differences between some of the social movements around race that we see today and the ones that, my grandmother's generation saw, is because the civil rights movement, the original civil rights movement, came out of the church. Yeah. It was born in the church. Most of the civil rights leaders were Black Christian ministers. And the white people that you saw marching with them were either Catholics or Jews.
Totally. I totally agree with you. And I think that the idea of, the idea that Dr. King would bring up over and over was the Constitution, which guaranteed freedom and equality to everybody. And also that we are all equal before God. Like we were all created equal before God. And how dare you take that away from us? And I think today's left is much more enamored of the idea of power than it is in the idea of equality and justice, right? Like there's kind of an obsession with who has more power, who is the oppressed in the situation, and who is the oppressor. And that's the most important thing in any situation to talk about. And there isn't really that feeling of of saying, look, some people have more power and some people have less power, but the way that we get to the a more equal society is by elevating those with less and forcing those with more to recognize that we are all the same. Like, we are all created equal before God, and we must all be treated equal before the law. Like, we've sort of lost that on the left, like being able to call that up.
No doubt. No doubt. And for those of you who listening who can't roll how we rolling right now, I apologize, but I'm about to go a little deeper on this because I think it's very important in this conversation that I'm having with my new best friend. So have you ever heard of the concept of the God-shaped hole?
The God-shaped hole? No, tell me.
Okay, so, and I believe in this. Like, there's this idea, and it came from, it was a Christian minister, I can't think of the name of it, but there's an idea that we're all born with a God-shaped hole in our heart that only God can fill, that only having a relationship, a connection with God can fill. And if you don't turn to God to fill that God-shaped hole, you'll try to fill it with other stuff. And so, to go back to what you're saying, what I believe we're seeing, and I think we're seeing it in politics generally, but particularly on the left, because there's more of a secularist type movement on the left that's manifests itself more strongly. I think what we're seeing is a bunch of people trying to fill their God-shaped hole with politics.
Oh my gosh, that's so deep. Oh man.
And when you do that, that it could manifest itself in really, really ugly ways.
Yeah, that vengeance piece that you talked about really seems to be very much at play these days.
Yeah.
I think you talked about the difference between justice and vengeance. And I think I often think about the difference between hypocrisy and justice. So one of my favorite philosophers, her name is Hannah Arendt, and she had this really cool thing. She once said, when we stop fighting for justice and we start fighting hypocrisy, we've lost, because we're all hypocrites. Like, that's just the human condition, is to like ourselves a little bit more, let ourselves off the hook a little bit easier, right? Like, that's just the human condition, is to be hypocritical. You cannot, if you spend all your time being enraged at your opponent's hypocrisy, you're never going to bring a more just world. Like, you have to just keep focusing on where do we get our justice from, as opposed to like how lame the other side is and how terrible they are and what they're doing wrong and how hypocritical they are. And I really relate to that.
No question, absolutely. And I think we get so caught up in that we lose sight of justice, and no one gets helped, and everybody is more divided. And meanwhile, situations get worse and worse and worse. Like in the city where I'm at, there are neighborhoods that have 60% at the poverty line, under the poverty line. Like, how does that happen?
So
how do you have an entire neighborhood where like 40-50% of the people in that neighborhood are out of work?
So what would fix that? Like, what's a policy that you would think that you would endorse, that you think this is like one thing that would go straight to the heart of that?
So I think there's so many different issues, but I think one in particular, and I can say this, we see this not only in Cleveland, where I'm at, but we also see it in a lot of Midwestern industrial cities, is that if you look at the history of Black folks who moved up here, like my family migrated from Tennessee up here. And in the Great Migration, we came up here, obviously, to escape the racism of the South, but we also came up here for jobs and economic opportunity. And at the time, you could go to a factory with a little, like my great-grandfather he left this earth not knowing how to read or write.
Wow.
Like he never knew how to read or write. But amazingly, he was able to teach himself how to drive and knew how to get to your house, even if he couldn't read street signs. He was a brilliant man. But he was able to work he was able to work and feed his family and things like that. And now we went from, in the middle of that, 20 years later, we went from a production economy to a knowledge-based economy overnight. With a lot of the trade policies that we had, with a lot letting China enter into the World Trade Organization, all of those sorts of things that decimated our manufacturing sector. And a conversation that I don't think a lot of us have when we talk about jobs being shipped overseas is the acute negative impact that had on Black people.
100%.
Because a lot of Black people moved up to these Midwestern cities to work in those factories, to have those jobs. And that was their access to the middle class. That was their access to wealth and prosperity. So part of the issue now, like I'll give you an example. We have here in Cleveland, we have thousands and thousands of jobs available with a population who's not trained to take those jobs. So we haven't given our own people the skill set needed to take the only jobs that are available now that give you access to real income in a knowledge-based economy. So you end up, that's how you can have a situation where my city has the second largest and most profitable hospital in the world with the ghetto right behind it.
Wow. And everybody who works in that hospital is an immigrant, is from somewhere else?
Many of the top earners are. So that's how you can have such a dichotomy. You can have, it's amazing. There's a neighborhood here called University Circle, and it is it has Case Western Reserve University, which is like our Yale. Like, it's a really, really big deal. It's where a lot of elites in high society go to college at. It has the Cleveland Orchestra, which is one of the biggest orchestras in the world. It has the History Museum, the Art Museum. It has our two of our biggest hospital systems, all of that. And you go a couple of blocks to the left, a couple of blocks to the right, and a couple of blocks behind, this abject poverty, surrounded by the wealthiest,
oh my gosh,
one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the entire state. And behind it is abject poverty in many cases.
Wow. Wow.
Obviously, there's, of course, the history of redlining. That's obvious when you see that. And then part of the issue that I have with this equity conversation versus access, because if you don't give people access to wealth, access to power, there are, like, most of our major cities have laws on the books that say that there's a certain percentage of their contracts, which is a big place where you can gain wealth, that their government contracts have to go to minority businesses. Almost none of the cities are meeting their obligations, right? Almost none of them. You can count maybe 2 or 3 are actually meeting their obligations. So as a result, the wealth that these communities are contributing to through taxes, they're not getting anything back from it in a way that can really impact their community. So in the Black community, we've seen studies and statistics. We know that Black businesses hire more Black people on average, even today in 2021, than businesses that are not Black owned. So the best, most direct way to positively impact Black people is to support Black businesses, because Black businesses creates more Black wealth in Black communities, and those Black businesses can hire more Black people. But instead, what we do is fight over crumbs. There's a local politician here who's actually a really good dude, who says, we spend more time in this conversation fighting over crumbs instead of just baking a bigger pie.
So how do we bake a bigger pie?
To me, you have to give real access to wealth and opportunity. We have to look at these governments, these state governments, these local governments, the federal government. How much money are you spending with Black businesses? In our county, for example, they're in the process. You can there's supposed to be a law in place that says you have to have, like, a contractor has to have, if it's a white contractor, you have to subcontract with a black company, et cetera, et cetera. But if you can't find one, you can just say, hey, we tried, we couldn't find one, and then you get exempted from it. Mm-hmm. And it happens across the country. So we could start there. Like, it's not a panacea, but we could start there. Maybe if you put more wealth in the hands of black people that create more jobs for black people, maybe we could start there. We have a huge problem in our educational system. Yeah. School choice is a really, really big deal. I don't know where I would have been had my parents not chose to send me to the schools that they chose to send me for. But it also resulted in us living in poverty.
Right.
Because of the fact that the voucher system was not robust, and my parents made $100 too much. So as a result of them choosing to put my education first, I grew up in poverty, and all of the things that come along with that. So a lot of the things that the elite, as we're talking about here, a lot of the things that they're putting on the table have nothing to do with actually solving the problem, because it doesn't put more access in people's hands. There are barriers to access all over the place. Another example, one way that you can do business with not only governments but also corporations, because major big rich corporations kind of function like governments anyway, right? Especially these multinationals. One, obviously, they have a process where you have to be certified as a minority business, an MBE or whatever. It is incredibly difficult when you go through that process. And a lot of black businesses, they don't have the stupid, just bureaucratic BS that these people ask for in order to prove that you're black. So there's so many different things in the way. Yeah. There's so many different, there's all of this bureaucracy. In Ohio, it takes more credit hours for you to become a cosmetologist than it does to be a police officer.
Wow. Are you kidding me?
Let's start there. And it's like that in many
ridiculous.
And in many states across the country, it's like that.
Are you serious?
There are more rules and regulations in many states across the country. There are more rules and regulations, more steps that you have to go through, more credit hours that you have to take in order to be a cosmetologist than it does to be a police officer in many states across the country.
Arvio, we've lost the plot. We have lost the plot. That is crazy.
Yes.
Oh, man.
Insanity. Because you have people, when you have the bureaucratic nightmare, you have people justifying their existence, and they put these rules in place that are stupid and it doesn't help anything or anyone. And all it does is justify their job as a bureaucrat.
Man, that is depressing. You're depressing me. There's so much bad news. I'm kidding. It's so important to talk about this stuff. It is so important. Man, you should run for office. Have you ever thought about that?
Oh, they ain't ready for me. They ain't ready for me.
Yeah, but they need you.
I think I can do the most good, being because media is another issue as well.
Yeah, for sure.
We don't own anything. So we are one of the only groups that I can think of in America whose entire cultural identity in media, in mass media and broadcasting, is owned by other people.
That's so interesting. Okay, so what does that mean? Draw that out for me.
So what that means is that we don't control our own narrative. We don't own a lot of these, like the black networks. I won't say any names, but the black networks, they're not black owned. Mm-hmm. The record label, the record companies that produce black music, they're not black owned for the most part. Mm-hmm. So everything that that identifies you to the rest of the country.
Mm-hmm.
Where for people who are in, the middle of nowhere, Iowa, who know nothing about Black people but what they see on television or what they hear in music, we don't control that. We don't own that. So as a result, we don't control our own narrative. We don't control our own messaging.
Wow.
And it prevents us from being able to use all of that wealth that is being generated by our content.
Oh my God.
Totally. To help our community.
Totally.
That's a big issue. And on top of that, it creates perverse incentives. It creates incentives for Black people to cater to the white elites who control the purse strings.
Totally.
Unless you're someone like Dave Chappelle that has FU money.
Right. Who's now they're trying to cancel him for offending the trans community.
But you can't do nothing with him because he has what I call FU money. When you have FU money, they can't do nothing to you.
Right.
So there's a lot. There's a lot. And we've just talked about all of the world's problems in an hour. So let's real quick. Let's get back to the book. Tell people a little bit more about the book.
God, I have to say, after everything we've talked about, my book feels so unimportant.
Oh no, it's very, very important. I'll tell you this. I'm gonna tell you how important it is. This is how important it is. First of all, the issues that you're talking about, a lot of times when we talk about it, people just ignore us. It is important. It's very important. And I tell people outside of our community things like this all the time. It's very important for people who don't look like us to be saying things like this, because it carries weight. And in some circles, it carries more weight coming from you than it does coming from me. So it matters. What you're doing really, really matters. And there was a joke that ironically Dave Chappelle told years ago. And I think it was like a police brutality joke or something that people don't normally joke about that Dave jokes about because it's Dave, right? and I think it was like police brutality or something going on with Black people. And he was like, white people don't believe it's true until they read it in Newsweek, right? So
wow.
I thought about that when I was writing that article.
Yes.
I thought about it. Dave Chappelle was
awesome.
like, white people don't believe it until they read it in Newsweek. So
that's hilarious. Well, let me tell you, your listeners are going to be able to be reading you in Newsweek quite regularly from now on, because this conversation, I've heard about 8 things that I absolutely have to have as op-eds, like ASAP from you. So I'm very excited about that.
I appreciate that so much. So yes. Let's before we wrap this thing up, let's go back to the book.
Yes. So my book is about how white liberals are using Black pain in order to erase the working class. That's essentially the argument, that they have adopted this posture towards questions of race in America that assume this kind of like maximalist view, right? This defund the police version of talking about race, when what Black people actually need are police officers who don't insult them, who don't beat them up, who treat them with dignity, but who are very much in their communities protecting them from crime, just like white people need. That's what it's about. It's about the huge gap between what the working class of all races in America need, which is dignity and autonomy, and what white affluent liberals talk about when they act like they're representing those people, which are things that actually just end up helping white liberals. That's what my book is really about. There's a history of journalism and how we got there, and basically journalists got rich over the last 100 years, and rich people tend to write for and about other rich people. But in this case, because they, liberals love to feel white guilt. They're writing increasingly about people of color, but in a way that's very alien from the way that people of color think about themselves and talk about themselves. And so I'm not an expert on that, but I am an expert on white guilt and how affluent white liberals talk to each other and think about each other and why they do what they do. And that's really what the book is about. And listen, there's nothing in it that you don't know firsthand from living your life and from your amazing experiences. And so when you say that it had meaning for you, I mean, that really brought tears to my eyes. And I feel so grateful that you told me that, and that, you got something out of it that was meaningful to you.
Oh, I really did. I really did. And I mean, it was meaningful to me in several ways. Like, one, I'm a media history nerd. So so I loved the particular excerpt that I read, was you talking about the history of journalism.
Mm-hmm.
And like you kind of referenced earlier, and that stuff fascinates me.
Mm-hmm.
I love that stuff. So to see that and see how they got to where they're at, and one of the things that I was reading, that I saw as I was reading what you wrote, that really stood out to me as you were talking about the way that they treat the working class, and particularly the white working class. I'm reading this. I'm like, they do the same thing to Black people.
Yeah, because class bigotry is class bigotry, exactly like you wrote in your piece. Like it really is a sort of a contempt. I call it a sneering campaign, a sneering and a smearing campaign. They sneer at them, and when that doesn't work, they smear them. Or like,
Yeah.
Another thing that I write in the book about is how, they used, the line among liberals used to be, how come the white working class is voting against its economic interests and voting for Republicans, right? So, okay, so they turned around and voted for Trump. They voted in their economic interests. And then they called them racists, right? It was like there was no way they were going to accept what these people were trying to convey. And I think, to me, like, those 18% of Black men who voted for Trump, I totally agree with you. I think that was about class. I think that he made working class people feel a sense of dignity, both in terms of how he talked about jobs and in terms of the actual policies that he put out there. And so really what that phenomena, I think it could have been such a wake-up call for Democrats and for liberals, like, hello, like, these people want what you want. You take Florida, right? Like Florida, which voted so overwhelmingly for Trump, and then on the same ballot voted for a $15 minimum wage, like, these people want the same things. And instead of uniting around a populist economic front that caters to the working class, they sort of sneered at them and called them all sorts of names in order to sort of consolidate elite power, just like you wrote about in your piece. So that's kind of what the book's about.
Absolutely. And it's something that I promise we'll wrap up soon. Like, we're way over time, but I figured it was going to be like this anyway, so I just hit the button and just let it roll, right? So and it was interesting because you talked about you had just mentioned the $15 an hour minimum wage, and there was something that happened here in Cleveland, which was very obvious and eye-opening to me. Mm-hmm. on that particular issue, and it intersects with the whole issue of white liberals catering to white liberals. So a couple of years ago, there was an attempt to have a $15 an hour minimum wage put on the ballot here in Cleveland. Mm-hmm. The problem was it would only be in Cleveland. It wasn't statewide, right?
Oh, interesting.
And which would have been a disaster for an urban city who's already having to deal with the issues of suburbanization and all those sorts of things, and urban sprawl, and pretty much everything that every other major city does, right? So, but the people who were pushing it and who got it on the ballot were white liberals who don't live in the city. So you're taking this policy that people would agree with because people want a $15 an hour minimum wage, and you're forcing it on one of the poorest big cities in America, to the exclusion of the cities where you live in.
Oh my God.
And if it would have passed, which it
Oh
didn't,
my God.
if it would have passed, all that would have happened would be that the businesses in the urban community would leave and go across into the suburbs where these people live.
Oh my God. I mean, I'm laughing because it's so funny how you're telling it, but it's like, what a disaster. No, and you know that these people were sitting there like high on their own virtue, right? While they were doing this, while they were screwing over the small business community made up of minorities.
Absolutely. And our leaders, our leaders, one, our mayor and our city council president who's running for mayor now, they were against it. And one of the reasons was they said, look, we're not against a $15 an hour minimum wage. We're against us being the only ones having to do it.
Oh my gosh, it's so messed up. Oh my gosh. But look, there's hope because they were like, this is dumb and this is not for us. This is to make you feel good about yourself. And it actually screws us over. And I always find hope in the people. Like, there's now this big sort of workers' revolution happening, these workers striking across the country. And these workers, they, some of them are Trump supporters, some of them are Democrats. They don't care, they've got solidarity. And that's what we don't have. That's what we and the elites were sitting here being like, because the elites, they benefit from polarization to the expense of the working class, and the working class doesn't care. They're like, we don't need you. I don't need your crappy union. I'm just going to stand here with my fellow worker and we're going to say no to these, these conditions, like, and I take a lot of heart from that.
Like in our situation where my mother lost her job at General Motors, it was her union that sold out their plant.
No kidding.
Yep.
Oh.
Yep. Yep, that's exactly what happened. But you said something that was really interesting, and I would like you to expand on that. You said that the elites benefit from polarization. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So what I tell people is, having written this book, I did a really deep dive into how digital media works. Like just the real nitty gritty of like why a headline looks like that. Why suddenly you started seeing all of these, 29 cats who are having a worse day than you headlines, or like, or a really good one from CNN from 2014 was, this girl stabbed her sister 29 times. You won't believe the reason why.
Right.
Right. Like, so, all of these, there's reasons behind all of this, which is that people who work at digital media companies have hacked how Google works. They've hacked how Facebook works, and their stories get to readers through Google and Facebook. And so if you can understand how those algorithms work and you can bake that into your headlines, your stories will travel a lot farther. Okay. And we have all of this information. Like, as somebody who I work at Newsweek, right? So I have access to the digital side of things. I have access to the back end, which means I know exactly where every single one of the readers is. I know how much money they make. I know what they're shopping for. I know how long they stay on the article. I know what words make them click on articles, right? So there's enormous incentive to put those words all over the article, to put them into the headline, to put them here and there. And that's how you get that engagement, which is how we measure success, right? Like, this is sort of how digital media works. And so the reason that it's polarizing is because the stories that do the best are the ones that make the readers the most emotional. And this is, the New York Times is like the number one malefactor in this. Like, New York Times is supposed to be the elite, the highest level of journalism. Yeah. All they're doing is making their readers feel emotions, because the more emotional you are reading a story, the longer you'll stay on the page and the more likely you are to click on that ad, which means that the New York Times can charge more for that ad, right? The New York Times literally says to advertisers, how do you want the reader to be feeling when they encounter your ad? And how much do you want them to be feeling? This is like on their website, they sell the emotions of the readers. What that means is that when you encounter something on your social media feed that makes you feel enraged, like that feeling of like, how could anybody believe this? Like, when you're feeling that rage, someone is making bank. Like, someone is making millions of dollars every time you feel that way, because millions of dollars have been invested in learning how to make you feel that way. So they're literally getting money off of our polarizing partisan rage at each other. So the media has become increasingly extreme, because the more extreme it is, the more engaged the reader will be and the more emotional they'll be, right? If you can cast your political opponents not as like friends of yours who maybe disagree with you, right? Like there's people in my synagogue who are pro-life and people in my synagogue who are pro-choice. Who cares, right? That's just your political opinion. What difference does it make? No, there's been millions and millions of dollars invested in making people think that somebody on the other side of the abortion debate is a murderer or is a Nazi, right? Or is literally the spawn of Satan, right? Like these people have put money into how to make us see our fellow Americans that way. And the only people benefiting from that are the media and politicians and big tech, because they are all getting either political power and clout or literally money, literally billions of dollars. Absolutely. And making us hate each other. But the good news is that most Americans, I think, are really resistant to that. I really think that most Americans just, we're not actually that polarized if you look at like polling on major issues. And instead of celebrating that, we just have these culture wars around these issues because people are really making money off of it.
Wow, that says a lot. I mean, it's essentially like the quote I put in the piece from our current mayor, that said, there are people who use the legitimate issues of the oppressed not to help the oppressed, but for their own benefit.
Totally. I think he's just exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, we see that quite a bit, and we'll get ready to wrap here because, like I said, we're way over. But there are, and I'm sure there are times, as you being a religious person as am I, like there are times where you're watching the news or reading the news and it's just so much negativity that it's like it doesn't vibe well with my spirit. Like I'm like, I gotta turn this off. Like I gotta cut this stuff off because it can't be healthy to be bombarded with negativity over and over and over and over again.
I think it really is not. And I think that the Black community is like the Jewish community, where you have people across the political spectrum. Like you can go to church and find people who you disagree with. And that's literally how we save this nation, is like finding people we disagree with, refusing to hate them, extending love to them, extending respect to them, remembering that, the beating heart of a democracy is tolerance for people we disagree with, and just protecting those spaces that are non-political in your life, finding more of them, going back to church, going to volunteer, finding people who you disagree with, and remembering what it's like to respect them. Because you're right, that negativity is just going to be the end of this country. And none of us can afford that. I mean, we are all so invested in this nation. I think especially the Black community is really, in some ways, the beating heart of America. As Nikole Hannah-Jones wrote in the 1619 Project, which became this sort of like culture war touchstone. But she wrote this beautiful essay about her father's patriotism and how Black Americans forced America to become a democracy. Like that was not something that was always the case. And so I think that we really cannot, we can't let go. Like we can't give up. We have to keep fighting for the values that this country was founded on, and also for, love and respect for each other.
Yeah. And to your point, African Americans, we don't hear this being said as much anymore, but it used to be said a lot that we were the conscience of the nation.
Totally.
And I think part of the reason, once again, that you don't hear that as much anymore is it goes back to the elite conversation. Like African Americans are very, very, are deeply religious culturally. Like we're deeply, there was, and I believe this was Pew Research as well, a few years ago, that when they did their, they kind of do their study on faith, religion, and public life and all that kind of stuff. And African Americans are second only to white evangelicals in our religiosity.
Wow.
Like that's how African Americans are deeply religious. And many African Americans have socially moderate or socially conservative views as a result of that. And that does not make the elites feel good.
Totally.
They don't like that stuff. And it's funny to me, and I see this too, this was a few years back, with Republicans when they start talking about like, well, what are we going to do? We got to get more minorities in. We have to do this. We have to do that. And and they talk about, well, this their social policy. A lot of the social conservative, social moderate stuff. Oh, well, we need to get rid of that. It's like, I'm like, oh, okay. So you're going to get rid of the stuff that Black people actually agree with you on. And you're going to appeal to them how? By cutting their taxes when we're not making enough money to pay taxes. Like, oh my God. Like, this is just, you sit there and you listen. And this is part of what I said in the article. I've been in these rooms. I've been around elite liberals. I've been around elite Republicans. And you sit there and you listen to them and it's like, really? That's what you think will work? Like, yeah. Have you ever met, in your life, have you ever known someone who comes from where I come from? Have you ever known someone who's had the experiences that people like me have had? Because if the elite in general actually knew the people that they spend most of the time talking about, they wouldn't say some of the stupid things that they say.
I think you're so right. I spent a lot of time reporting in the South during the Trump years, and I was shocked by what I found there. Just, Black and white people praying together. All the Black people voted for Clinton. All the white people voted for Trump. Nobody cared. Everybody was religious. Everybody felt like, I wish the jobs were better. Everybody felt like in some ways the Republicans had abandoned them economically and that the liberals had contempt for their religion. Like it was just like, really exactly like you're saying, like, from within these communities, things seem so different.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right, now that we've spent an hour and a half.
You're just so delicious to talk to.
Oh, I appreciate that. This has been a pleasure. Like, we're going to have to do this again.
Oh my gosh, anytime. Thank you so much. This was just such an honor for me. Thank you so much.
I appreciate that, but I'm not going to let you go without plugging the book, letting people know where you can get the book, making sure that people follow you on social media, all of that good stuff.
Okay, so the book is called Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy, and you can get it on Amazon or at encounterbooks.com. And you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is @BungerSargon, and you can find Darvio's beautiful op-eds at newsweek.com, where you will find me and also hopefully many more of your op-eds in the near future.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on the show. You have such a sweet spirit. I can already tell that you're genuine about these issues and that you genuinely care about these people. And that means the world to me. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You just brought tears to my eyes again. Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Absolutely.